Chapter 15 of Meetings, Part 1. His name was Garrett, and Rainbow didn't like him from the start. Maybe it was that casual smile of his, one corner of his beak always smugly pulled up, as if he were remembering a joke at your expense. Maybe it was the lazy way he spoke, like he'd never had to try at anything in his life, and he didn't expect he ever would. Maybe it was the long-barreled revolver strapped to his vest, hidden under his silver shoulder cape and only revealed for brief moments when he raised a foreleg, flaunted just out of sight like a casual, unthinking threat. Most likely, it was his habit of always disappearing into Rainbow's blind side. She was safe for now, at least, relatively. The whole crew, minus Sunfeather, who had elected to stay behind and watch Princess Luna and the Argo, were hemmed in on one of the interior trams that ran the length of the Orichalcum. Rainbow kept her blind side close to the railing, Applejack's warmth against her left flank lending her some comfort, and that allowed her to keep her eye trained squarely on the strange new griffin, watching for any sign of aggression. The tram line raced across the ship at a quick pace, ruffling Rainbow's mane with the wind of their passage and filling her ears with the loud racket of the gears that propelled it along. The tunnel was dark, lit only by a pair of lanterns dangling from the thick bars that served as a roof, and the intermittent flashes of sunlight from the little porthole spaced on one side. Just a quick ride from the hangar to the living sector, Garrett had said. Rainbow hadn't been counting, but even 1 second near him felt far too long. He glanced over, catching her eye, but she didn't look away. She wanted him to know that she was onto him. She knew what he was. A griffin. And she had never met a griffin that didn't turn out to be bad news. He stepped closer, weaving around star trails and flintlock so he could be heard over the din of the gears.
Is that real?
She didn't blink.
What?
Your mane. He raised a talon and pointed. I've never seen anything like it. Is it? Rainbow's lip curled back as she cut him off with a ferocious snarl.
It's not a dye job.
He didn't flinch, but he did arch a brow.
This your first time seeing a griffin up close? I'd understand if you were nervous, but I don't bite, you know.
Everyone on the tram was looking at her. From the corner of her eye, Rainbow could see Sea-Saber giving a subtle shake of her head. Instead of spewing out one of the dozen biting retorts that came to mind, Rainbow looked away, her wings hovering a few inches off her back. She forced herself to take a deep breath and keep her gaze forwards. Saber didn't want her to stand out, and that meant not picking fights. That meant keeping her head down and her mouth shut. For once, Rainbow was determined not to let the other Pegasus down. Garrett opened his mouth to say something, but Star Trails came to the rescue.
Hey bud, just drop it, alright? Don't take it personally.
Rainbow's tail flicked about behind her, and she let out a quiet sigh of relief as the griffin finally got the message. With a shrug, he stepped back to the center of the tram. Thankfully, the ride didn't last much longer. The tram slid to a screeching stop, releasing its passengers into a pristine white hallway with a long window running along one side. Glancing through it as Garrett led the crew deeper into the ship, Rainbow realized they were walking along the top of a long, cavernous room of drab gray metal. Ponies trotted across the floor below in small groups, boarding or disembarking from longer, dirtier versions of the tram she had just taken, or streaming through hallways labeled with scuffed paint. They all wore jumpsuits, similarly color-coded, though many of them sported simple shirts, coats, or skirts on top, and some had their jumpsuits rolled up and tied around their barrels like belts.
Yep, that's airship life.
Rainbow jumped, head snapping around to see Star Trails walking on her left with an apologetic smile.
Sorry, I was raised on a ship like this is all. Brings back memories, you know?
After a moment, Rainbow nodded. She turned back to the window.
What do the colors mean? Well, that tells you where they work,
Trails explained.
It's different in every fleet, but you can usually tell a few of the common departments. Those guys in red with the goggles and dirty faces? NG. I bet the sweaty ones running around in yellow are maint, and you can always tell the nav crew from their altitude. That bear in blue strolling around like she owns the place? She's probably nav. Huh.
Rainbow pursed her lips in thought as she followed the other mare's pointing hoof.
What were you? They slapped me a nav as soon as I was old enough to get a suit. Believe it or not, I used to be as pretentious as she is. Really?
Rainbow shot Trails a skeptical sideways glance.
Somehow, I can't imagine you being stuck up like that.
She shrugged.
That's how they raise us. But one day I got to leave the fleet, and it turned out the world wasn't exactly what they taught me.
She smirked, turning her green eyes forwards once more.
I guess that's why I like to see things for myself these days.
The window ended as Garrett turned them down another hallway towards a thick, silver-embossed hatch with a pair of ponies in black jumpsuits standing to each side. Each one wore a set of heavy steel shoes trimmed in silver, the tips sharpened into deadly points, and Rainbow could see the stiff shape of armor plates hidden under their uniforms. They didn't offer any challenge for Garrett, though they did sweep the ponies following him with suspicious stares. Rainbow glared back at each in turn, daring either of them to say anything. The hatch was already open, and Garrett led them through without breaking stride into a small foyer. Rainbow's ears twitched as she noticed a slight, hollow sound to the floor under hoof here, and looking around, she saw that the solid white walls had given way to thin silver plating over layers of gears and piping, reminiscent of the bare machinery visible throughout much of the Argo. 3 hallways split off from the foyer, and they continued straight down to the central one towards a wooden double door engraved with a blue and silver compass rose. The swinging song of brass instruments could be heard playing a gentle and jazzy tune on the other side. Garrett knocked once, lifted a towel into each handle, and paused for a brief moment before pulling them open.
Your guests are here, sir.
Ah, finally. Prince Silverblood turned to face them with a smug smile, his body framed by the daylight streaming in through the wide window behind him. Layer upon layer of silken robes were draped over his pale yellow coat, held up by silver ribbons and adorned with matching jewelry. His white mane hung down his neck in a series of thin braids, each one swaying with the weight of the colorful baubles tied into the hairs.
I was beginning to worry you weren't interested in breakfast.
Rainbow pursed her lips, concentrating every bit of willpower she had into keeping her mouth shut and her face straight as anger flared up inside her. She instead cast her eye around the room, taking in the blue and white sitting cushions on the long, oval-shaped table they surrounded in the center, and the spread of soups, bread, and salads atop it. Paintings of airship and city islands adorned the walls, the Orichalcum itself prominent in many of them, framed in thick, engraved silver that seemed to twinkle in the light of the 3 chandeliers hanging above. But the room was shaped like a triangle, and no matter where she looked, her gaze was always pulled to where Prince Silverblood stood behind a weighty wooden desk embossed with even more silver highlights. A single curving window was set into the wall behind him, forcing her to squint into the bright sunlight after the passage through the far dimmer interior of the airship. After a moment, she realized that the room was perched at the very top of the ship, the white of the hull stretching out behind the glass. Sea Saber stepped forward, her tone level as always.
We apologize for the delay. We came as soon as we could.
She dipped into a bow, muzzle almost to the wood-paneled floor, and shot a meaningful glance back towards her crew. Rainbow's eye widened as she saw Star Trails and Flintlock follow suit, and then Applejack a moment later. She was expected to bow before this moron?
Discipline,
Sea Saber's voice echoed in the back of her mind, recalled from so many training sessions.
that is your weakness. Overcome that, and you'll be the most dangerous mare in Equestria.
She had to do it, for both Twilight and Sea Saber. She was done with losing control and letting them down. Biting her tongue hard enough to draw a trickle of blood, Rainbow forced her body down into a stiff bow.
Understandable. But do not fret, the food is still warm, and so there's little damage done.
Silverblood's voice was rich, swinging from one word to the next as if every sentence were a game.
Won't you sit? My chef is experimenting with a new aioli, garnished with truffle shavings from ambrosia. We'll have to risk it together, though I expect it shall be as marvelous as anything he makes.
We'd love to,
Saber said, straightening up.
You're very kind.
Star Trails spoke up.
Isn't Ambrosia under Platinum's control? I'm surprised the family would sell to you after all the trouble they went through to colonize it.
Silverblood's grin widened at the comment.
The Platinum estate has been disbanded in the wake of internal conflicts. But thanks to their work taming the natives, I've been able to invest in the creation of a small colony, and they send shipments ahead to my major stops. But enough of our business. Sit, please.
It was all Rainbow could do to keep her hooves from shaking as she carried herself over to the nearest cushion. She focused on taking deep breaths, her eyes staring intently down at her empty plate. A dozen mouth-watering scents tried to tug her gaze upwards, but she ignored them all out of concern that even seeing the conceited pony hosting them would drive her into a frenzy. The prince barely paused to take a breath.
You know, Crazy has told me quite a bit of your accomplishments. Your success in Old Canterlot has been on every pony's lips ever since that party of his. Though I see a couple new faces here.
He let out an exaggerated hum.
Whatever happened to the pilot and the historian? Off to other opportunities?
Sunfeather is watching the ship. Dusty Tom lost his life on duty,
Saber said.
These two mares are recent additions. I'd be surprised if you had heard of them.
Oh. I'm sorry to hear that,
the prince said, and Rainbow was certain that he didn't mean a word of it.
You know, I always told Crazy that Stallion was a bad hire. I said, why hire 4 gifted and 1 common pony? You'd might as well go all the way, but of course he didn't listen.
The prince let out a heavy sigh.
Sweet Celestia, I've never seen a mare regard an empty plate with such intensity. Hello? Are you there?
Rainbow looked up, hoping the revulsion inside her wasn't making it through to her face.
Hey.
Oh, a quiet one. Not what I had expected, considering those marvelous colors you put on your mane.
The prince laughed, slapping one hoof against the table.
What is your role aboard Miss Saber's vessel, my dear?
Rainbow didn't answer. Her hooves shook under the table as she focused only on keeping her mouth shut, for she knew that if she opened it, she wouldn't be able to control the words that flew out. Luckily, Saber came to her rescue.
She's security.
Oh, security? Really?
The prince turned it to Saber with a smirk.
So Crazy digs up a mare from the past, a mare he claims to have legendary abilities beyond imagining, and he assigns her to security on a salvage crew led by Sea Saber, the butcher of Birch Ninny?
Saber's eyes narrowed a fraction of an inch.
You can never have too much security.
Rainbow's gaze flicked between the two ponies as she came to the sudden realization that she was witnessing a play in a game with far more context than she knew. Prince Silverblood and Crazy Rich might have been peers, perhaps even partners, but they were far from friends. And with Saber speaking as a representative of Crazy, she had to be careful to measure every word. Now she understood why Saber put so much emphasis on her keeping her head down. Was Silverblood sizing them up even now behind that flamboyant facade of his, weighing two legendary gifted under his control against the potential of a burned bridge with an old trade partner? Or was he just probing Saber for information that might be useful at the negotiating table months or years down the road? At last, the prince looked away with an appreciative hum.
Oh, yes, I suppose you're right. And you would know. There's no telling what might have cost a ship out in the open sky, after all. Better safe than sorry.
He clapped his hooves, and Rainbow's ears twitched at the sound of doors opening to either side.
But we mustn't let the food sit any longer. My chef would be heartbroken to hear that we let it grow cold while we busied ourselves with small talk. Let's eat.
Rainbow looked to either side as a pair of ponies wearing the polite pounce of servants entered the room. They circled the table from opposite sides, one pouring drinks while the other served food, and she took the opportunity to scan the room for Garrett. The Griffin, annoyingly enough, had installed himself in a corner near the back of the room, out of sight from all the guests, unless they craned their necks around to spot him. Applejack, seated to Rainbow's immediate left, nudged her with a hoof to get her attention.
Hey, you good?
She offered up a reassuring smile.
Don't worry about him, all right? I got your back.
Rainbow answered with a hollow smile of her own.
Right. Thanks, AJ.
Saber waited for the servants to back away, each plate and glass freshly filled before clearing her throat.
As much as I'd love to sample your chef's cooking, our cause is urgent. It would be easier for me to enjoy the food if we could negotiate the terms of our stay first.
Silverblood raised a hoof. He leaned back as one of the servants speared an olive on a fork, swirled it about in a small dish of aioli, and held it up for him to pluck free with his teeth. After taking a moment to rinse the morsel down with a drink from his glass, he let out an exasperated sigh.
Very well, very well. But I have a stern policy of not mixing business with pleasure. We may discuss terms in my office.
He stood abruptly.
Bring your new crew with you, Saber. The rest may stay and eat.
Saber frowned as she stood.
I would have thought you'd want to keep this discussion more private.
Well, of course.
Silverblood grinned as he walked to the side, beckoning to Garrett with a hoof.
But what is the deal without witnesses? I shall have my dear Garrett and Sassy, and you will have your...
He paused, squinting up at the ceiling.
I'm afraid I can't recall their names just now, but I'm sure that can be remedied shortly. Follow me, please.
He trotted out of the room without waiting for a response, Garrett following behind him. Saber turned to Rainbow and Applejack.
Let's go.
Applejack stood with a sigh, but Rainbow raised a hoof to hold her still.
Are you really gonna let him push us around like this?
She asked. Saber pursed her lips, but Star Trails answered for her.
Do you want to get off this ship quick, or do you want to stand up for yourself?
She quipped between bites of food.
'Cause you're not gonna get both, so pick one. What, but... Flint!
Rainbow waved a hoof.
Back me up here!
Flint pulled a bowl of soup away from his mouth with a belch.
Don't you look at me now. I'm here for the food and I'm getting it.
Come on, Artie,
Applejack said.
Let's just buckle down and get it over with. Fine.
With a frustrated growl and a flick of her tail, Rainbow stood and stalked towards Saber.
But I don't like this.
Neither do I,
Saber said.
You're doing well. Keep quiet and we can be out of here within a couple days.
Rainbow grimaced as she followed Saber and Applejack down the hall that Silverblood had disappeared into, the jazz music fading away as they left the dining room behind. It was a short walk. The hall ended in a small elevator large enough for only a few ponies, already half full with Prince Silverblood and Garrett's griffin bulk. A mare with a soft pink coat and a curling green mane leaned against a terminal next to the elevator, chatting quietly into a brass tube. She wore her black jumpsuit rolled up into a belt, revealing a cutie mark of 2 white stars circling each other on her flank. Rainbow suppressed a grumble as she squeezed into the elevator beside Saber and Applejack. Silverblood turned to the pink mirror and gave her a quick nod.
If you would, Sassy.
She leaned into the tube, pressing a button on her terminal with her magic.
Sassy, Prince and 4 coming up for you.
With a click of machinery, the elevator lurched upwards. They came out into a small foyer with an identical terminal, brass tube, and Rainbow did a quick double take, an identical mare, cutie mark and all.
I've got him, Sassy,
she said. The magic faded from her horn as she turned to Silverblood with a warm smile.
Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, my dear. Come along if you would.
Silverblood led the little group across the foyer, past a short hallway lined on one side with doors, and into a room dominated by a hefty wooden desk laden down by stacked folders. There were no windows in this part of the ship, but the room did have a wide painting on each wall that seemed to try and fill the same purpose. They were framed in silver and depicted the type of ocean landscapes that one might see from aboard an airship in flight. He sat behind the desk with a sigh, while Garrett and Sassy, the second of two Sassies Rainbow assumed, stood in opposite corners behind him. There was only a single seat on each side of the desk, so Rainbow and Applejack were left to stand behind Saber.
So,
Silverblood smiled a toothy, lopsided smile.
Let us discuss business.
The conversation was dull on the surface, and trying to parse the double talk and implied meaning under every word did little more than give Rainbow a headache, so she was quick to tune it out. With one ear open to the back and forth between Silverblood and Sea Saber, she turned the rest of her attentions elsewhere. Garrett kept his eyes pointed straight forward, ignoring her pointed glares and suppressed scowls, and after several minutes of the griffin remaining still as a statue, Rainbow turned her eye onto the strange pink mare standing in the opposite corner. Sassy's horn was glowing a faint white as she muttered something under her breath, her hooves gesturing animatedly as if she was in the midst of exchanging some juicy gossip. She'd pause every minute or so, ears twitching, and then raise a hoof to her muzzle before letting out a subdued snicker. And all the while, her eyes remained glassy and unfocused, only occasionally clearing whenever she did a quick scan of the room before returning to her phantom conversation. It was impossible to tell how much time passed. There were no windows and no clock that Rainbow could see, and soon her hooves were fidgeting with boredom instead of irritation. When Silverblood finally began to clear the papers he'd pulled onto his desk and Saber finally rose from her seat, Rainbow didn't even bother trying to hide her sigh of relief.
I assume there's a thermogram on board, Saber was saying. I'll need to contact Mr. Rich.
Of course, I'll let the operator know to expect you.
Silverblood opted to remain seated as he spoke.
And about the funds...
Speak to Star Trails, Saber said. The unicorn. She handles the finances.
Excellent.
The prince leaned forwards with a wide smile, extending a hoof to shake.
A pleasure doing business with you, Miss Saber.
Likewise.
Saber's voice was steady as always, as she took his hoof and shook. Maybe Rainbow was imagining it, but after so long living with the other Pegasus, she thought she could hear a trace of annoyance. She turned away, beckoning to Rainbow and Applejack with a nod. Let's go.
No, let them stay.
The prince leaned back into his seat.
I'd like to talk to them.
Saber looked back over her shoulder with a frown.
You have no business with them.
Not true.
The prince gave an exaggerated shake of his head.
I'm always on the lookout for new talent, after all, and it isn't every day you'll come across miraculous young talent like these two.
He turned to Rainbow and Applejack in turn.
Tell me, how much does Crazy pay you, and how long are your contracts? I'm sure we could come to an agreement.
Rainbow's lip curled back in disdain, and she was just about to tell the overbearing stallion off when Saber stepped in front of her.
We aren't to disclose the terms of our contracts,
she said, pushing Rainbow back with a hind leg.
You'll have to ask Mr. Rich himself for that information.
Oh, how mysterious.
Silverblood steepled his hooves under his chin, narrowing his eyes with a playful smirk.
But I suppose it would kill the fun if there wasn't any chase.
Very well then. He popped out of his seat, smile widening.
Let us return to our meals. But remember, Phyllis, I pay well for unique talent, and I'm willing to negotiate a fair contract. Negotiation is, after all, a useful skill to have in an employee.
We, appreciate y'all's offer,
Applejack dipped her head.
but we're happy where we are.
Fair. Would you lead us out, Sassy?
Yes, sir.
Rainbow could feel Silverblood's smiling eyes boring into the back of her head as she followed Applejack and Sea Saber out of the room and back to the elevator. She ignored him outwardly, but there was a cold pit of worry forming in her stomach as she walked. Most of the conversation had gone over her head, but she didn't need context to know that she hadn't heard the last of Silverblood's offer.
Wow.
Anna thought as she shut the window closed behind her.
Bureaucratic espionage is fool's play compared to corporate.
The Commoners Guild security would have been laughable if it existed. After a few minutes casing the building inside and out, Anna had decided to try the easy answers first, and, much to her surprise, it had worked. A few flaps up to the Guildmaster's window, a few seconds with a thin blade, and she was in. The Guildmaster was busy downstairs. She could still hear the muffled voice of him speaking to the petitioners, so she expected she'd have some time to herself to search the room. Just in case, she trotted up to the door and ensured it was locked. It wouldn't be the first time she'd been caught in some office by another sleuth sneaking in from an alternate route. She didn't have all day, however. She had a ship to catch, and so she went from cabinet to cabinet and folder to folder with the steady beat of a practiced spy. Her amber eyes skimmed the pages at a quick pace, searching for the key phrases and patterns that she knew from experience led to the dark secrets of ponies in power across Equestria. It didn't take her long to find what she was looking for. A hidden compartment built into the bottom of the desk concealed a collection of letters. From the broken seals left on the scrolls, it looked like correspondence between the Commoners Guild and the many trade guilds that dominated everyday life in Friesland. One in particular, from a couple months ago, looked to be addressed to an organization called the House of Guilds. Anna wasn't too familiar with Friesland politics, but if the gaudy seal and trim on the paper was any indication, it was important. From the desk of Mr. Cart Marx, Master of the Commoners Guild. She narrowed her eyes, skipping past the formalities that rich ponies loved to thicken their letters with. The laborers grow restless. I recognize that it is a hard time for us all with the sudden influx of Stratera goods, but a temporary period operating at a loss may be necessary to prevent unauthorized strikes or, worse, a riot. I recommend allowing some victories for the laborers. They only need a few wins to feel as if they've shown that they still hold some power over us, and then we may return to business as usual. It may hurt in the present, but a small loss now can lead to greater profits in the future. Anna arched a brow. That didn't sound like the advice of a pony who had the commoner's best interests in mind. She rifled through more of the hidden papers, a small grin pulling at her lips as she found a response. This one was far less verbose, opting to get straight to the point instead of flaunting a long line of honorifics or pleasantries, something which Anna had come to understand meant the writer was speaking from a position of power. From the desk of Mr. Robber Baron, Speaker for the House of Guilds. Let them have their victories. The Lumberjacks Guild and the Smiths Guilds have fared well despite the disruption. We will allow some reforms in these areas. Do what you must with the Darkworkers to keep them in line. We cannot afford any trouble with our shipping. As this is your suggestion, we trust you will not protest if we deduct the damages from these reforms from your regular stipend. Anna shook her head in bemusement. Of course the Commoners Guildmaster was on the take. It was the same story she'd seen just about everywhere across Equestria. Those in power were in power absolutely, and those without were only allowed the illusion of being able to influence the world at the convenience of their master's priorities. She flipped through several more letters, confirming her suspicions. The Commoners Guild as a whole was a sham, bought and paid for by every other guild in the city, a false bulwark of popular power that the guilds used to manipulate common sentiment. When the grumbles from workers grew too loud, they were allowed some minor victories that made them feel as if they had won, but otherwise they held no power. For a trivial fee, or trivial compared to the cost of safe factories and extra days off, the Commoners Guild could gather your every complaint into one place and make them quietly disappear. Anna's ear twitched at the clatter of hooves on the stairs. She grabbed a few of the most incriminating letters and stuffed them into her jerkin before carefully replacing the hidden compartment. She took a few long, silent steps to the door, wincing at the quiet click as she unlocked it. Even a pony as security lax as this cart Marks might think to check his valuables if he found his door suddenly locked for no reason, and then slipped out the window. She had just finished closing it behind her when she saw the doorknob twist, and she wasn't interested in meeting her Mark face to face. Tucking her wings in tight, she dropped down into the damp valley in a flutter of dark cloth. The thunder of cannon fire rolled over the city, and Anna smirked as she imagined the wall garrison applauding her agility. The relaxed gait she might normally use would be more out of place in the face of the stiff wind that blew through the shadowed afternoon streets, so she ambled out into the street at a hurried pace. Her hood pulled low and her cloak drawn tight, she set forth. It was a quick walk to the run-down part of town where Anna and Gava had been renting their room. She still wasn't sure what the inn was actually called. The innkeeper didn't seem to have any interest in fixing the sign, and the closest Anna ever got to talking to the surly stallion was a nod in the mornings and at night when she came down to fetch a meal. But part of her liked it better that way. She gave the barkeep the traditional nod as she bustled past two lonely patrons up the stairs and into the dimly lit room she'd been calling home for the past week. Her nose twitched at the heady scent of blood as she shut the door behind her. Gava was leaning over the cheap tin cabinet they'd been using for a table, her talons stained with the same red as the little carcass draped over its surface. Anna licked her lips. It had been a while since they had had cat, and variety was always enticing.
Tame or feral?
Gava shrugged, keeping her eyes on her work.
What's the matter to you? Feral cats are all stringy,
Anna said. She reached into her saddlebags and pulled out her stolen letters.
If you want good cat, you need to get a nice fat one. Fat cats can barely run, Anna. Stringy or not, the meat on a street cat tastes better after a decent chase.
Gava glanced back, arching a brow at the papers Anna had tossed onto the bed.
What's that? I met with Whitehorn.
Anna stepped over to the old wooden chest holding her father's skull, the well-oiled hinges silent as she lifted the lid and peered inside.
He wanted some dirt on some guild ponies, so I got it for him. Aside from that, I've got good news and bad news.
Gava paused. She turned fully, licking her talons clean.
Good news first. Good news is I've got something for you to do.
Anna jerked her head towards the papers.
I need you to drop these at a print shop. It's Kerner and Sons, over by that distillery near the south gate. Very hush-hush, code phrases and all. If you've ever wanted to live a couple thrilling hours between my wings, here's your chance. That's the good news?
Gava asked. Anna looked back with a wry smirk.
Says you're chasing cats through alleys for fun. It's better than torturing popular barkeeps, but you're obviously bored out of your mind. I'd been hoping we could do another raid like we did with that airship.
Gava's talons clicked against the stone as she stepped up to Anna's side, brow furrowed down at the smaller mare.
Got some ideas for new targets. Scoped them out just like you showed me.
Her beak twisted up into a hopeful smile.
It was pretty fun last time. Just the two of us again.
The memory of a stallion on the ground, begging for Luna to save him from a monster, flashed through Anna's mind. Her gaze flicked over to the barely visible splash of dark blue, mostly hidden under her father's bleached griffin skull. Rarity's gift to her.
Yeah, that was nice, but Whitehorn didn't like it. So what? Since when do we do what ponies tell us? Since you made a messy contract.
Anna shot her sister a pointed look.
And the pay's not bad either.
Gava opened her beak, no doubt to make a snappy comment about how they'd been squatting at an inn so cheap they could count breakfast without getting out of bed, but Anna cut her off with a good-natured slap from her wing.
We're making airship money here, sis. Once this is over, we can hitch a ride to Baltimore, find something good to replace the Screech. We just need to hold out a bit longer.
Gava grimaced.
We can never replace the Screech. You know what I mean.
Anna sighed, leaning into her sister's plumage.
But our family's still together. That's what matters. You sound like Dad.
Gava wrapped her big wings around Anna's shoulders, pulling the thestral tight against her chest.
So, bad news?
Anna didn't answer right away. She'd been mulling over this conversation ever since the meeting with Whitehorn, and now that the moment was here, she found a knot of apprehension forming in her gut. She closed her eyes, taking comfort in the sound of Gava's heartbeat.
Well, Whitehorn wants me to steal some things from Castle Urtica. What?
Gava stepped back with a sharp scowl.
We aren't supposed to mess with armies. No, sounds like Dad,
Anna quipped. She sighed as Gava narrowed her eyes, clearly not appreciating the joke.
Look, I can handle it. That's 4 siege lines. And then you'll have to come back. I can sneak onto one of the troop transports. They fly in at night, and you know nobody ever checks the bottom of an airship for infiltrators. But what if you're caught? They'll kill you.
Anna cocked her head, arching one playful brow.
Me? Caught? Anna, this isn't a joke.
Gava growled. Her talons flexed, scoring pale scars into the stone as she stood.
I'll come. To protect you.
Anna was always a little touched whatever her sister's protective streak showed. She couldn't stop the warm smile from creeping onto her face.
Sis, if we ever find ourselves in a world where me sneaking into a place is a joke and you doing it isn't, then we may need to find a new line of work.
Gava's tail lashed, but she didn't bother with a response. Instead, she narrowed her eyes and stared Anna down in silence. Anna's smile faded as the seconds stretched on. Without more words to riff off, there was no way for her to twist the message that Gava was sending. The job would be difficult, and it would be dangerous, and she wasn't an invisible, immortal shadow above the perceptions of pony kind. It was an odd idea coming from the typically headstrong Griffin, but then Gava had been noticeably more cautious about them splitting up ever since that disastrous assault on Titus's estate. They'd both thought they'd lost each other at one point or another that night, and Gava had taken the lesson to heart. They weren't invincible, and every time they split up might be the last time they saw each other. But the job had to be done. In much the same way that Gava was trying to protect Anna by protesting now, if one of them didn't help Whitehorn get what he wanted, Gava would be the one he punished for it. At last, Anna broke the silence.
You know you can't stop me from leaving, right? And you can't stop me from following.
Anna frowned.
Sis, I appreciate it, but I know you won't do anything really stupid until you see my body with your own 2 eyes. And but I need to be going soon if I want to catch the next ship out. So how about we agree it's dangerous and just enjoy a meal together, huh?
She offered up a small smile.
I don't really care if the cat's stringy.
After several seconds, Gava turned away.
Fine.
She stalked over to the cat carcass, tail flicking stiffly from side to side.
You wanna go downstairs and cook this thing then? Sure.
Anna stepped up and leaned against Eva's side.
Come on. With luck, maybe we can scare off the last dregs of this dive's business.